The Young and the Restless spoilers certainly. Based on these new developments and speculation from The Young and the Restless, here is a new long-form, dramatic narrative written in English, in the immersive style you've requested. This installment focuses on Kane Ashby's deepening suspicion, Carter's loyalty, and the dark possibility that Damian's death in Nice was not a spontaneous crime, but a premeditated assassination ordered by Kane himself, perhaps motivated by jealousy, betrayal, or a secret from the past. This version blends known facts with speculative intrigue, structured into long, uninterrupted paragraphs that build tension and emotional stakes, fitting the soap opera tone while logically following from your provided plot points. The haunting elegance of the Nice estate, with its old-world beauty and sprawling vistas, had become the perfect cover for a tragedy far more sinister than anyone in attendance could have imagined. What was supposed to be a retreat, a celebration, even a reconciliation of old colleagues and former lovers, had now mutated into a crime scene soaked in suspicion. And at the heart of it all, unmoving, unnerving, and silently dangerous, was Kane Ashby. His name echoed in whispers throughout the corridors, in side glances, in hastily exchanged theories and fears. Because if there was one person whose presence bound all the chaos together, it was him. The bourbon. The dagger. The victim. The guest list. Even the location itself bore his fingerprints. But it wasn't until whispers of Carter's involvement began to circulate that the weight of the truth, or the possibility of it, settled like fog on the minds of those who remained behind. It all began with a seemingly casual drink. Bourbon from Kane's private collection. A gesture of hospitality, or a trap disguised as civility. Both Kane and Damian had drunk from the same bottle, and yet, only one would die. At first glance, it seemed they had both been drugged. But suspicion soon crept in. Had Kane merely pretended to be under the influence? Had he staged his own weakness as a performance to avoid accountability or, worse, to place himself among the potential victims? The dagger that pierced Damian's back was no ordinary weapon. It was a relic. An antique. Something once admired by Damian himself, a collector's item steeped in symbolism. The fact that such an intimate object had been used in his murder sent shivers down the spines of everyone familiar with the case. This wasn't just a killing, it was personal. Ritualistic. A message carved in steel and blood. But even the method of death paled in comparison to the questions surrounding motive. What had Damian done to merit such a fate? Why had Kane fired him in the first place? Was it about professional betrayal? Or had Damian discovered something he shouldn't have, something Kane couldn't afford to let surface? The most volatile theory, however, was the one that wrapped everything into a perfect storm of jealousy and revenge. Lily. Damian. And the moment Kane arrived at the estate to witness a connection between them he hadn't anticipated. He hadn't known of Lily's private affection for Damian. Hadn't known they'd reconnected, or worse, become entangled emotionally and physically, until he saw it with his own eyes. The flash of betrayal, the realization that his former employee had become his rival not just in business, but in love, may have set the wheels in motion long before the first glass of bourbon had even been poured. Still, none of this could be proven. And none of it would be more than speculation, if not for Carter. Quiet. Efficient. Invisible until now. Carter, who had always been more than a simple assistant. Carter, who, according to recent whispers and damning reports, would do anything for Kane Ashby. Anything. The kind of anything that sends shudders down spines and forces even loyal allies to take a step back. He had been seen moving between rooms, whispering into phones, appearing and disappearing with unnerving precision. And no one knew where he had been at the exact time of the murder. Carter, who may have been the one to drug the bourbon. Carter, who may have waited until Damian slipped into unconsciousness. Carter, who may have delivered the fatal blow with the very dagger Damian once admired. If Kane was the architect of this scheme, then Carter was the executioner. And yet, Kane maintained his innocence with steely conviction. He claimed he had invited Chance to Nice because he was afraid for his own life. That someone was after him. That there was a threat, vague but looming. But what if the threat was fiction? What if the danger was a smokescreen crafted to bring a lawman into the room and legitimize a crime designed to look like something else? What if Chance's presence was not for protection, but to provide cover? Kane had invited everyone to the estate under the guise of celebration, but what if it was a masquerade from the beginning? A carefully choreographed performance designed to kill one man in plain sight and blame the circumstances on chaos? The timing, the sedative, the setting, the maze, the alcohol, the dagger, it all pointed not to a spontaneous act of violence, but to something premeditated. Cold. Unforgiving. Efficient. Victor Newman hadn't been the only one blindsided by this chaos. Lily, too, was unraveling beneath the weight of possibility. The idea that the father of her children could have orchestrated a murder out of jealousy or rage made her stomach twist into knots. She had loved Kane. She had believed in his second chances. She had defended him. And now? Now she sat in silence, replaying the events again and again. The invitation. The bourbon. The dagger. The look in Kane's eyes when he saw her and Damian in the moonlit corridor. That single second might have been enough to change everything. What if he had already planned the murder, but that moment gave him the emotional justification he needed to follow through? And what if Carter, ever the loyal shadow, had simply waited for the signal? Even Devon, as logical and loyal as he was, began to waver. In quiet moments, he spoke of how little they all knew about the true relationship between Kane and Damian. Perhaps there had been a betrayal none of them had been privy to. A secret. A debt. A deal gone wrong. Perhaps Damian had tried to blackmail Kane, or worse, had succeeded. Perhaps the firing wasn't about performance but about silencing. Perhaps Damian had discovered something about Kane's finances, about the shell companies, the international assets, the things that Devon himself had once been too polite to question. But Damian hadn't been polite. He had been ambitious. And ambition, when turned against a man like Kane, was a death sentence waiting for a trigger. So the question no longer became whether Kane could have done it. It became, how far back had he been planning it? Was the dagger brought from Genoa City for this very purpose? Was the maze manipulated to create just enough confusion to separate Damian from the others? Had Carter planted the sedative weeks in advance? Had every step of this descent into chaos been planned with the same precision that Kane once used to run companies and manipulate markets? And if all of this were true, then who else knew? Was Phyllis really a bystander, or had she witnessed more than she admitted? Did Amanda suspect deeper involvement but was choosing to protect Lily from the full truth? Did Chance already see the pattern, but was waiting for one more piece of evidence before making the arrest? One thing, however, was becoming painfully clear. Damian Kane had not died because of a sudden argument. He had not fallen victim to a random act. He had been marked. Targeted. Executed. And whether the hands that pushed the dagger belonged to Carter or someone else, the mind that had set it all in motion could very well belong to Kane Ashby. The man with too many secrets. The man who always knew how to manipulate a narrative. The man who had invited death into his own house, and dressed it as hospitality. Let me know if you'd like to continue with Amy confronting Lily and Kane, Chance's theory falling into place, or Victor getting involved to protect the Newman name at any cost. The night air around the estate in Nice had grown heavy, thick with unspoken truths and tension sharp enough to cut through silence like a blade. Somewhere beyond the lush vineyards and manicured hedges, a maze twisted and turned like the mind of the man who had brought them all together. It was in that maze, under the veil of darkness and deception, that the first fatal act had taken place. But before the dagger was thrown, before the blood hit the earth, there had been a private moment, one shrouded in false civility and thinly veiled hostility. A moment between Kane and Damian. Alone. unwatched, unrecorded. A heart-to-heart, as Kane would later call it. But there was nothing heartfelt about it. It was a warning. A confrontation dressed in polite aggression. Kane had discovered what he wasn't meant to see: Damian's connection with Lily, and the betrayal, whether real or imagined, ignited something in him that had long simmered beneath the surface, control slipping from his fingers. Damian hadn't expected Kane's anger to boil so quickly. He had thought himself safe, invited to a gathering under the guise of professional détente, a reunion with faces familiar and tense. But Kane's invitation wasn't about diplomacy. It was bait. An opportunity. A controlled environment where he could isolate Damian, confront him, and perhaps, according to the darkest suspicions now swirling around the investigation, eliminate him. What began as a discussion devolved into accusations. Kane demanded to know how long Damian had been involved with Lily. Damian, always calm, didn't deny it. He didn't have to. The truth was written all over Kane's face the moment he had seen the two of them alone earlier. And that truth had shattered whatever threadbare restraint Kane had left. While that private confrontation unfolded behind the high, dense hedges of the maze, Phyllis Summers had wandered nearby, excluded from the increasingly strange social flow of the evening. She hadn't been invited to Kane's little talk with Damian. No one had. It was meant to be off the record, untraceable, invisible. But Phyllis, driven by curiosity and that unshakable instinct for sensing when something wasn't right, found herself drawn to the edges of the labyrinth. She didn't hear voices, but she felt the tension in the air. And then, without warning, she saw something, a flash of movement, the tail end of a shadow disappearing deeper into the hedge wall, and then the glint of metal soaring through the air. A dagger, flying like a whisper. By the time she reached the clearing, Damian was already on the ground, the hilt protruding grotesquely from his back. But the hedges had done their job. They shielded the killer. Whoever had thrown the weapon had vanished, leaving Phyllis with blood on her hands, figuratively, not literally, and no face to accuse. It was that blindness that had begun to haunt everyone. Phyllis had seen the aftermath, but not the act. And yet, the absence of visual evidence didn't dampen the questions that quickly poured forth. Why had Kane pulled Damian aside? Why wasn't Phyllis included in a conversation that, if truly innocent, should have had nothing to hide? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why had Kane made such a spectacle of inviting nearly every power player in Genoa City to a private event in a foreign country under the pretense of a vague, undefined threat to his life? As the days passed and the layers of this gathering began to unravel, a darker theory began to spread through whispers and private conversations. What if Kane had used the supposed threat as a smokescreen? What if he had summoned Chance Chancellor to Nice not for protection, but for legitimacy, to create a lawful presence that would mask his own intentions? After all, why bring an American investigator across borders when the local police were only minutes away? Unless, of course, you didn't want the local police involved. Unless you wanted control of the narrative from the very first moment the body hit the ground. There were more than a few who were beginning to question Kane's motivations. From the Newmans to the Abbotts, and even within the legal circles surrounding Michael Baldwin, the whispers had become warnings. Michael, always astute, had already begun raising questions about the nature of the guest list. Why had only certain people been invited? What did they all have in common? At first glance, nothing. But on closer inspection, there were threads, financial entanglements, business ties, dormant rivalries. And then there was a deeper fear. What if Damian wasn't the only target? Carter's role in all of this loomed larger with every passing hour. The man who had always operated in Kane's shadow now appeared to be a vital player in a far more sinister game. Loyal to a fault, capable of executing orders without hesitation, Carter's devotion had always raised eyebrows, but never alarms. Until now. Because if Carter had been ordered to eliminate Damian, what would stop him from targeting others? People who owned companies Kane wanted. People who stood in his way. People who, knowingly or not, had become obstacles in the quiet expansion of his influence. If Cain could justify eliminating Damian to remove a romantic threat, what might he do to a corporate one? The list of potential victims wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. Lily, Devin, Abby, Nick, Sharon, even Chance. Anyone with a name, a legacy, or a claim to something Cain wanted was at risk. And if this conspiracy extended beyond Damian's murder, if it included manipulating the maze, planting sedatives, and staging confrontations, then no one was truly safe. The very gathering Cain had claimed was a refuge from danger may have been the trap itself. And if so, then every toast, every drink, every private conversation had been choreographed to hide a single truth: Cain was not afraid for his life. He was afraid of losing control. And he would do anything to keep it. Back in the estate's great room, Chance reviewed the guest list again, his fingers tracing names with the growing realization that he may have been brought here under false pretenses. The timing, the lack of local law enforcement, the inconsistencies in witness accounts, it all pointed toward a calculated deception. And if Chance had been manipulated, if his presence had been weaponized to create a false sense of order, then his badge meant nothing here. He wasn't a protector. He was a pawn. As the investigation deepened, so too did the divide between truth and appearances. Phyllis was desperate to find the missing piece she knew she'd overlooked. Amanda was starting to question whether Cain's silence was born of guilt or strategy. Devin and Abby had begun reviewing business transactions dating back months, searching for signs that Damian may have stumbled upon a secret worth killing over. And Lily, oh poor Lily, was caught in the crossfire, torn between love, loyalty, and the gnawing fear that the father of her children was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Because if Cain did order Damian's murder, and if Carter had carried it out under the guise of loyalty, then this wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a campaign. And the war had only just begun.